First church I've been in since I sang in the choir. Well, I'm very happy to be here. It's a kind of, in a way, it's like a nostalgic trip for me, because the first time I was aware of going on holiday, because when I was little, the only time I ever saw the countryside was when my mum and my gran and my aunts took me hop picking with them. But the first kind of time the first holiday I remember going without them, as it were, was the local Cub and Scout church. Took us little kids, I guess we were about sort of 8, 9, maybe 10. They took us to camp under canvas in somewhere near Corfe Castle. And I guess, looking back, I guess it was a kind of a landowner who had some kind of connection with the East End Church, you know. So I was under canvas and I had to walk an awful lot. Everywhere seemed a long walk to get anywhere, you know. But I do remember it being wonderfully beautiful. And in fact, in 1965, 66, I came back to shoot Far From the Madding Crowd. I was billeted in a rather nice hotel in Weymouth. Of course, on those big movies, that was like a sort of 3-month shoot, you get lots of time when you're not working. So I was able to explore the wonderful county of Dorset. Anyway, I'm sure you'd like to ask me some questions about the Madding Crowd or my life in general, so please feel free to shout out so I can hear you. Yeah.
I have 2 brief questions.
I'll bring you the mic.
Thank you very much indeed. I have two brief questions. Acting has been described as a physical rather than a cerebral process. To what extent do you agree? And secondly, the works of William Shakespeare have been described as the actor's Bible. Are you a regular reader of William Shakespeare?
In answer to the first part of the question, I think, there are performers who favour the physical, in the sense that if they can find a way into the character in a physical way, that's a mainstay for them. However, I don't really think it matters kind of how you get into the part, because I think that once you get into the part, then in some magical way the part is kind of talking to you. And in my own case, although I was a theatre actor initially at drama school, I was discovered at drama school in my 2nd term playing Iago in Othello. So I must have been pretty good. Because agents weren't supposed to come to the end of the 2nd year, And in truth, this famous agent had been leaned on to come and see the boy who was playing Othello. But he saw Terence Stamp. And I remember finding a kind of fury that erupted in me when I was delivering the soliloquies. And I remember going down to the front of the stage and really engaging with the audience and screaming at their need. Anyway, that was when I got discovered. However, and I did other Shakespearean roles while I was at the Webber Douglas Academy. I can't say that I've studied Shakespeare, but as my life's progressed, I've come to understand a lot more of what Shakespeare was talking about. To be or not to be is the mainstay of my life. But I only came to that through my performances. And they only really started happening to me in a physical, well, not physical, there was a kind of emotional thing that happened during the very last sequence of the first film I made. And it's connected with Lionel Bart, who was a good friend of mine. Also, he directed me in a musical play. But he introduced me to Anthony Newley. Now, Anthony Newley was a real hero of mine because he was a working class yobbo like me, you know, and he was a last-ditch discovery by David Lean as a kind of 12-year-old. And I had always loved Anthony Newley. And when Lionel took me to meet Anthony Newley, it became apparent that Anthony Newley had just finished composing, or he'd composed most of the score for Stop the World, I Want to Get Off. And he was so excited to have Lionel, who was this kind of already completely known and famous as a composer. He was so excited to have Lionel in his house, and I'm pretty sure he didn't notice me. However, he did play and sing the whole score. What kind of fool am I? And I was there. I was one of the first people to ever hear it. You know? And at the end of this wonderful repartee, he suddenly realised there was this kid there. You know? And Lana said, "Oh yeah, that's my friend Terence. You know, Terence and I are doing a play called Why the Chicken, and he's become a good friend of mine." And Newley said, "Wow, it's kind of great to meet you, you know." And I had his attention. And I said to him, I looked in his eyes and I said, "What to do?" And he thought for a minute. And then he said, "If in doubt, do nothing." Which didn't really make a lot of sense. It made sense to me, but because it was from him. It was from this like god of working class actors. You know? However, during shooting the last scene of Billy Budd, there was a direction, and it said, as the character was about to be hung, it said, "A look of utter peace comes over the young sailor." And it's so profound that the crew, who are kind of mutinying at this injustice, are silenced by this vision that's happened. And I thought, fuck, how am I going to do that. All the way through the shooting, I kept turning to this page and thinking. And in truth, there was nothing came. Nothing came. And on that very last afternoon, I thought to myself, well, I'm going to have to try what Nuni said. Which I didn't remember, but was the most terrifying thing of all, you know. And so I stood on the mark, and I remember the assistant saying, stand by, turn over. And as he said turn over, this amazing feeling came. And it was not like anything that I had ever experienced before. And I couldn't really, I never felt like, well, it all happened so quickly, but I never ever took ownership of it. Because afterwards I came to the conclusion it was a kind of otherness. It was not anything. I'd never experienced anything as pure as that before. And when the director said cut, and Ustinov being, you know, a highly evolved person, he just said, we got that, print. So that became my first experience. And then during the ensuing years, occasionally things like that would happen. To this day, I mean, the last film I made, which is something called Song for Marion, that feeling happened on every take. But I don't want to give you the impression that it's ever become like mundane or expected, because it's just not like that. But in some way, it's kind of like it's the best of me in the sense that it is what is looking. So it's kind of prior to the movement of thought. It's a kind of, it seems that it's a kind of sense of being that comes out of a silence or comes out of a quietness. Sorry, back to another. I'm sure I've answered all your questions.
You've had such an amazingly effective acting career. Has there been any particular role that you've taken on that you thought about afterwards, maybe I shouldn't have?
The first role that came up, well, there was Billy Budd, and then there was a thing called Term of Trial, which I did, although that was a small part, I got to work with Olivier, so I wasn't going to pass on that. But after that, I had two producers send me the galleys of the yet-to-be-published John Fowles book, The Collector. And I read it, and it was obviously a masterpiece. I mean, it was just so beautifully written. But I knew from the first chapter that it just wasn't for me. It was a kind of he wasn't ugly, he was just invisible. He was a kind of spotty bank clerk that nobody ever noticed, and I thought, I might not be Marlon Brando, but I'm not that, you know. And they kept coming back to me, and I just kept saying to my agent, yeah, just tell them no. And then after about 6 months of this, they got onto my agent and they said, look, we've got William Wyler. Is he going to turn down William Wyler? William Wyler was arguably one of the most successful directors of all time. I mean, I don't think William Wyler made a film that wasn't commercially successful and wonderful. And I said, does Wyler want me? And they said, yeah, it's really interesting. And I said, who's the girl? And he said, well, they're testing girls. And I said, and this is true, I mean, may God strike me dead. It sounds strange now, but at the time it was a kind of insecurity, really. And I said, look, why don't I test with the girls? If he's testing girls, I'll test with the girls, and then he can see how close I can get to this. So consequently, I tested with Samantha Eggart and Sarah Miles. And Wyler didn't do the test, but Wyler flew over to see them. And I was asked to go and meet him at the old Columbia building in Wardour Street. So I go along, and I'm taken up to like a vestibule on the first floor. And I'm standing there, and I'm aware that like doors are opening and people are looking out. And then right at the end of the corridor, about as long as this room, a door opens and this rather diminutive figure comes out. And he comes like slowly, not shuffling, but walks slowly towards me. But he's just looking at me. Unwavering glance. And he gets really close to me. And he stops right in front of me. And he doesn't speak. And this kind of unnerves me, you know. And I say to him, so finally I say to him, have you seen the tests? Which girl do you like? And he says, the first words that Wyler ever said to me was, I haven't looked at the girls yet. And it sinks in. And I say to him, so, do you want me? And I say, but in the book. And he comes really close to me. And he whispers in my ear, we're not going to make the book. We're going to make a romance. Unusual. So that was how I came to being the collector. Yeah.
You mentioned a large number of fictional roles that you played, and I know for one that you ended up getting shot. I'd like to remind you about another film that you played, a real person who ended up getting shot. How did you approach the role of Colonel Ludwig Beck?
Say that again?
How did you approach the real life role of Colonel Ludwig Beck? Sorry if that's a strong.
No, I'm just thinking about it. By this time in my life, my performing is very, it's rather sophisticated in the sense that there's a lot of characters that, unlike things like Priscilla and stuff like that, I don't have to study. Because I know there's enough knowledge within me. And as soon as I learn the lines, it will start coming out. And that's basically where I was at, like during the shooting of that film. You know?
Thank you.
Terence, you just mentioned Anthony, your brother was in the music business as well, This isn't an active related story or question of anybody's written, but famously there was Terry and Julie in the King's Waterloo Sunset. Now, I don't know if you ever met Ray Davies, and I don't know whether he ever actually said to you, what's the story about you and Julie? But I would imagine the line that gets me is Terry meets Julie at Waterloo Station. I would have thought at the time you were making famous film from around here, from Island Crowd. So you would have been with Julie anyway, rather than me. But was this story true?
The thing was that Julie and I started a romance before she became really famous. However, that story was related to me by my brother Chris, who was more of a kind of ruffian than me. And my mother, and he was 4 years younger than me, but he was really like a young spiv, you know. And although he went to Glasgow Grammar, where we both went, he wasn't particularly interested in studying. And my mother asked me if I could kind of have a word with him. I didn't feel I could have a word with him, really, because as soon as we were both grown up, there was sibling rivalry in the mixture. The fact that I was older, the fact that I'd left home, you know. So with some trepidation, I asked him up for a coffee, and I was living in a basement with two other boys in Harley Street. And I was at drama school. I won a scholarship which paid me £8 a month, so I was living pretty which was the rent, you know what I mean? So I was living pretty hand to mouth. So Chris came in, and he obviously kind of like just didn't want to be there. I mean, he obviously didn't want to be there. And I finally said to him, is there anything like that you really like? You know, you're not doing a proper job, you're not really doing, is there anything you really like? And he said, yeah, I like music, like rock and roll. And I had this kind of flash, you know, because I had been working at drama school in order to keep myself alive. I'd been working backstage at theatres. I'd worked Sadler's Wells, and I was a dresser on West Side Story, and then I was a light operator on West Side Story at Her Majesty's. So I said to him, well, you know, I said, you know, while I was thinking about it, and then he said, oh, and girls. And I said, what kind of girls? Well, muscly girls, like dancers, girls like that. And I now had this flash. And I said, well, if you went along to Sadler's Wells, just introduce the stage doorkeeper and tell him you're like looking for a job. You'd do anything. I said, you will meet the most fabulous dancing girls you've ever seen. And you can't get hold of them if you don't meet them, so this is the first step. And he didn't visibly respond. However, a a few months later, I got a call from a friend of mine, and he said, "Your brother Chris is cutting a swathe through the dancers at Surface Road." And as a result of that, he realised that it was too big a climb to go from a stage man to like being successful in rock and roll. And the next thing I knew, he'd met this guy called Kit Lambert, who was the son of Constant Lambert, who was like one of the great English composers. And Kit Lambert was gay, but he was completely the opposite of my brother. In other words, he was from the most sophisticated background. But they'd got on like a house on fire. And they'd found this group. They decided that if they could find a group and make them famous, that would be a big, proper entree to the world of music. So they found this group called the High Numbers, and my brother renamed them the Who. And as his height, they had the Who, Jimi Hendrix, Crazy World of Arthur Brown, and he told me the story that Ray Davis had told him, "Your brother Terry, I was thinking about your brother Terry and Julie when I wrote that song." I came in from Waterloo this morning, so this is an appropriate question.
We were so delighted to see the Far From the Manning crowd on the big screen the other night. That was a real treat. But I wondered, when you were preparing for the role, did you reread the novel?
Yes, I reread the novel, and I reread the novel because I had been cast by the producer, who was a guy called Joseph Yannick, and he knew me because he cast me in Modesty Blaze. He was the producer. Although it was a big flop, he liked me, you know. And consequently, Schlesinger never liked me. Or he never showed that he liked me. And he was kind of offended that, well, this is my reading of it, was that he felt I'd been hoisted on him by Joe Yannick. So in other words, he really made it as difficult for me as possible. And one of the things, the most difficult thing that I most remember, and it was the reason I read the book repeatedly, because I thought, I'm on my own here, you know what I mean? Like, I've worked with Weiler, I've worked with Ustinov, I've worked with Losey, I've had these great directors adding to my success, making something out of me that I'm not. And now I've got this guy who really doesn't want me. And incidentally, both Peter Finch and I dislike both of us. We wouldn't go along with these kind of camper, you know? Anyway, he said to me before the movie, I got this call from an assistant, and he said, "Oh, Mr. Schlesinger has heard that you're rehearsing the sabre with your left hand. And the fact is that left-handed swordsmen were not in the army until after 1870. So he wants you to learn it with your right hand." Now, anybody who's naturally left-handed will understand that I'd virtually never used my right hand. I mean, of course I did, but I didn't use it for anything definitive, writing or drawing, you know, I was shaving, I mean, I was left-handed. And so I went to the Master of Sword, who was kind of teaching me, and I said, he wanted me to do with my right hand. And which was how I became so proficient. But it also was the beginning of a new part of my life. Because after that, any new skill that I had to learn, I did with my right hand. So by the time I was like 30, I was completely androgynous. And to this day, I still shave with both hands. You know, I do everything with both hands. However, during the shooting of the sword sequence, which is Troy's great, you know, where he woos Bathsheba, Schlesinger didn't cover it to any great deal. In other words, he just shot the minimum of what he needed, what he thought he needed for the sequence. And where, you know, I have the kind of luck of the Irish, the DP, the director of photography, was this guy called Nicholas Rogue. And Nicholas Rogue would later go on to become a famous director. But at the time, he was just this legendary lighting cameraman. And this was the first film I made with big screen. And Nick Rowe came to me shortly after I'd finished the sword sequence. And he said, "We can do better than that. When we finish tonight, get your sword and we'll go somewhere." So every night, for about 10 days after that conversation, he would look at me, I'd grab my saber, we'd go somewhere, and he would have his hand held, and he shot everything, me, both hands. And so that sequence was actually, it was painted by the kind of Picasso of lights. And I don't think that I've ever been made to look better. The thing about the magic that you can see, I don't look like Sgt Troy. I don't look like Billy Buck. But through the eyes of the camera, it finds the best in me, and it minimizes the least in me. But with Nick Rowe really understood. And that's consequently, it was my mother's favourite movie, you know. She only ever wanted to talk about Sgt Troy. Tell her neighbours about Sgt Troy.
Mr. Stamp.
Yeah.
From the gods, as it were.
Ah, yeah. There's a guy with a voice that I appreciate.
You are envied by many people in this room, and dare I say it, in a time of such equality, possibly marginally more by the male of the species than the female. You have been very fortunate. You worked with a number of very beautiful women, including Julie Christie. And earlier you started to explain how you get into character. My question is, how on earth do you get your feet back on the ground immediately after the most convincing embrace with one of the most beautiful women in the world?
By a lot of repetition. I have to say that it just makes me think, it brings back a memory, because when I was, because it happened as a boy in the cinema, do you understand? Like, I didn't have much of a life, as it were, and so consequently, the pictures became a mainstay for me. They became like the constant in my boyhood. And when I was about 14, I guess, I went to see a movie that was at the Granada in the East End that showed unusual movies on a Sunday. And I went to see a movie called Bitter Rice. And I came across the 17-year-old Sylvana Mangano in the first pair of hot shorts that any woman had ever worn to great effect. And I was so crazy about her. I mean, I think I sat through that movie twice. And consequently, when I worked with Fellini, which was, you know, another great master that came into my life, he had asked me to go back to Rome after I'd finished the shoot to do some post-syncing. There was a couple of wild lines that he needed. And in those days, you couldn't kind of record them in London and transpose them. Yeah? So I flew back to Rome. I did the post-syncing, and I was just strolling down Via Condotte. And on the shooting of Toby Dammit, which was the name of the Fellini section, I had a guy who was the greatest clothes designer I had ever worked with. He was a guy called Piero Tosi. And Piero Tosi was I think he was a Florentine. Anyway, I saw Piero Tosi walking down Via Condotti with another guy, a taller guy, and a woman. And I realized that the woman was Sylvana Mangano, albeit a young grandmother at the time. So it turned out. And I'm staring at her, and Piero sees me and says, "Oh, Terence, you know, this is my friend Sylvana Mangano, and this is my friend Roberto Coppa, and you know, it's lovely to see what you're doing in Rome." And I'm just fixated on her. And she says to Piero in Italian, which I didn't speak, I never mastered the language, but I knew a little Italian. And she's saying to Piero in Italian, "Wouldn't he be wonderful in Pier Paolo's movie?" And then she realizes that I'm listening. So she says to me in English, because as it turned out, her mother was English. She says to me in English, "Do you know Pier Paolo Pasolini?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, he's making a movie." And I said, "Are you in it?" And she said, "Sì, certo, certo." And consequently, the next week, Pasolini flew with his assistant, who was the nephew of Visconti, flew to London, and I went to meet them in the Claridge's Hotel. I thought it was a funny choice for like this left winger, you know. And he just came up to me, we were introduced, and he said through the translator, "This is a story about a very bourgeois Milanese family. There's a father, mother, son, daughter, and maid. Into this house arrives a stranger. He sleeps with everybody and leaves. This is your part." I said, "I can do that."
The new Humpty players have just completed a tour of Trumpet Major locally, and inevitably this time start thinking about what should we do next. The one that hasn't been performed yet is Far from the Madding Crowd. I just wonder, apart from expertise with the sabre, what would you like to see come out from Sgt Troy's point of view in a play? What are the main characteristics you'd like to be shown?
I think the only thing I really missed, and I didn't completely miss it, but I was nervous about playing such a kind of unattractive man. And it's something that I didn't think of, because at the time, I never thought it was a bad thing for a guy to have an erection every time he met a new woman that he never got hold of. I just thought it was rather good for me and the female population. And it took me, and I had to kind of get a lot older, in fact, before I began to realise like what women actually thought about me, and I kind of manifested that in Sgt Troy. And I guess, you know, if I were adapting the film into a theatre play, I would do more of that. I would give that more, because in a way, the Peter Finch character and the Sgt Troy, they're kind of related. And the kind of Farmer Oak, who's Alan Bates, is the more kind of, you know, he's more of a man that a woman would. I mean, from my own mother and father, I think that, like, the married condition for most people, at a certain point, becomes a discipline. And you have to be able to move from being frantic lovers to being enduring friends. And that's something that I didn't have a lot of in my early youth.
Just add on that the scenes with Fanny Robin are very powerful and tend to get overlooked in retrospect because of Julie Christie.
Yeah.
And I think seeing the film again, that was very powerful.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of, I haven't seen it for a long time, but, you know, it was something that I really grew to admire because, as I say, because it was a long time, it was a long time coming when I looked as good as that. And I think that, I'm not absolutely sure, but I believe that Julie, you know, has a lot of reservations about appearing in public, you know, for that very same reason, because it just was the best of us, you know.
We all went to see this when it came out in 1967. Oh yes. And we just thought it was the most smashing film we've ever seen. I seen it the other night, 50 years on. It's still one of the most smashing films I've ever seen.
Yeah.
But I wonder if being that, were you a hearty enthusiast before that, or did it make you into an enthusiast? Have you read any other of the novels or indeed the poems that we all love dearly in this society? Or are you a Hardy fan?
I haven't really. And it's only because, and this may sound pretentious, but it's really not, because as a young man, I used to read a lot. And in fact, my mother my mother belonged to somewhere called the Beckton Road Library, which was in Canning Town. And she trusted me to take her books back and find new books for her, which was just, she just wanted something to read, you know what I mean? But I began to become a bit discerning about what I was reading. But the big change in my life, and I think it's worthwhile mentioning, is that, only because I wrote about it in my last book, and that was that during the time that I was shooting Toby Dammit with Fellini was writing an original screenplay, and it was called The Voyage of Mastorna. and it was never actually made into a movie. But in The Voyage of Mastorna, which was a kind of, it was a kind of a nickname that he had for Marcello Mastroianni, who was his kind of fave actor at the time. And he, as the Voyage of Mastorna was about a character who, during the action, becomes enlightened. And so he was modest enough to realize that he might like the opinion of somebody more enlightened than him on his script. So he knew a woman who was a very wonderful aristocratic woman called Contessa Wanda Scariveni. And she was a famous socialite in Rome. Although she was rather beautiful and very sophisticated, she only ever wore open sandals, which is where I got the idea from. And so he knew that she knew this guy called Krishnamurti. So he got in touch with Wanda and he asked her if she could introduce him to Krishnamurti. And in fact, what happened was that when she phoned back and said, yes, Krishnamurti is going to be in Italy next May or whenever it was, I'll arrange for you to meet him. So he met with Krishnamurti and he took Krishnamurti to a little studio and he showed him the rough cut, like 20 minutes or so, of the film that he had been making with me, as an example of his current work. This is what I'm doing. This was all unbeknownst to me until years later. But apparently Krishnamurti watched this little rough cut and said to Fellini, I'd like to meet that boy. Which I'm sure Fellini was quite taken aback, probably offended, you know. And that was how I got to meet Krishnamurti, because on the Fellini film, I had an interpreter called Patrizia. And Patrizia was a friend of Contessa Wanda. And Patrizia said, my friend Contessa Wanda would like you to come to this lunch. And Krishnamurti is going to be there. And I said, who's Krishnamurti? She said, and at this lunch, there was a lot of the Italian arm of Time and Newsweek. There were journalists there at this lunch. It was quite a big lunch. But at the end of at the lunch, I was sat opposite this little Indian guy, who I could see was kind of exquisite. But he never spoke to me, and I was staring at him because he was so exquisite, basically. And but sometimes these eyelashes, which were incredibly long, his eyes would be lifted and he would look at me. And I would just kind of look away because there was something, I felt that I was kind of intruding on him in some way by staring at him. But after the lunch, his assistant, who was a man called Alan Naudet, came to me and said, Krishna Ji would like to know if you'd like to go out for a walk with him. Yeah, sure. So we met outside the house and we walked through urban Rome. And suddenly, from being speechless, I couldn't stop talking. And at a certain point he stopped me and he put his hand on my arm. And he said, look at that tree. It was a tree. I look back at him, he looks at me, he smiles, I smile, we carry on walking. I carry on talking. 5 or 10 minutes later, he stops me again. He says, look at that cloud. Cloud. He smiles, I smile, we carry on. I carry on talking. That was my first meeting with him. However, there was something in me that couldn't rest after that. And I would go, when he was lecturing in London, I would go to the lectures. And I couldn't understand a word. He didn't use big words. But he would say things like, the thought is not the thing, you know? Yeah. But that was the kind of, the beginning of the big change in my life. And so in retrospect, it wasn't surprising that by 69, I just stopped getting work. It wasn't that I was like bad. It was in films that were big flops or anything. It just dried up. And consequently, that's how I wound up in India, because I thought to myself, he's Indian. I know he's like English, but he's Indian. And I'd heard that there were like wise men in India, you know, and I thought, maybe if I go to India, maybe if I start lower down, I can start understanding this thing that he's talking about, that I couldn't fathom. And so that was kind of like, you know, that went from The Mind of Mr. Soames, which was in 69, until I came back to do the first 2 Superman movies. And at the time, I was living in this ashram. I'd gone to India to meet extraordinary people, you know what I mean? And when I was living in the Taj, I wasn't living poor, I was doing okay. And there was a lot of people there completely in orange. And one of them saw me and maybe recognized me and said, and I said, what's that? He said, if you come to Pune, come to this ashram, there's this great man there, you know, he's extraordinary. So I got the train to Pune. I checked into a hotel called the Blue Diamond, and the next day I went to meet the Guru, and he asked me to move into the ashram, which was kind of like a big honor, because most of the sannyasis, you know, lived in digs outside the ashram, because the ashram, it wasn't small, but it only could house about 50 people or so. And so I was there, and I had never met a speaker like him. He was the greatest speaker I think I've ever met, even to this day. He was a sort of combination of Orson Welles and Charles Lawton, you know, and he worked without notes, and had this beautiful voice and beautiful delivery. And of course, you studied. The reason it kept you so engaged was that you could study things. The ashram was full of these group leaders who taught you things. One of the things I was interested in was tantric sex. which is how to separate orgasm from ejaculation, which means your essence is recycled, which gives you quite lengthy erection periods, which I was interested in. Even as a sannyasin studying the spirit, I was interested in the Tantra. However, on Sunday mornings, myself and a lot of English, because there were people from all over the world, including fantastic looking people of both sexes. So I would go with some of the English sannyasins. We'd go back to the Blue Diamond Hotel to have a proper breakfast. It's worth mentioning because it's called full English breakfast, which meant everything English that was food was on the same plate. Do you understand? There was a big blowout Sunday morning. Anyway, as we're going into the hotel, the concierge, who obviously remembered me from my weekend there, suddenly said, "Mr. Terence, got a cable for you, sir." Rummages around, picks up this dog ear. Don't know if you're old enough to remember, yellow, like with the name stuck on the front. He gives it to me, and I look at it, and the psychic weight becomes increased as I read the address. Of course, it's addressed to Terence Stamp, the Rough Diamond Hotel, Pune, India. And I thought, this has got to be good, you know. So I slit it open, and it's from my long-suffering agent who discovered me playing Iago. And he says, "I don't know if you'd be interested in coming back to London to meet with Richard Donner. He's directing Superman 1 and 2. You'd be working with Marlon Brando." So I was on the plane the next afternoon, which was my return to show business.
I'm very aware that there are people that have got to get trains and so on. So I wonder, are there any other really burning questions that anyone would like to ask?
I don't need the microphone, I'm a loud voice. Just a very specific question about the film Far From Man in Crowd, which we saw the other night. It struck me, seeing it again, that the four principal actors, Bathsheba and her three male suitors, all essentially speak without a Dorset accent. And the rest of the cast, the rustics and the servants and so on and so forth, all have Dorset accents. Do you know can you remember how that came about? Was that a specific decision to do that in the film, to have a kind of hierarchy?
I know that when I was working on it, I learned it with a Dorset accent. And when early on we rehearsed for about a week, and Schlesinger said, "I don't think it's kind of necessary." Like he just, I'm sure Finch never learned with the Dorset accent. I'm sure Alan didn't. So it may have been that my Dorset accent was kind of comical in some way. So he may very well have thought, "I'll have the principal speak his standard English." But the other thing about it, which is something that wasn't the case, wasn't a fact, but the truth was that the finance, the main finance, came from MGM. And in those days, they didn't want to know about local accents. It was just one of those things, you know. If you're giving a guy like, $5 million to make a movie, and it's a lot now, but it was like a hell of a lot there, you know. So I think that's probably the reason, because even now, a lot of people in America have trouble understanding my version of the line, you know. I'm playing this Cockney burger and my brother.
Okay, before we thank Terence, we've got one more thing, if we may, and that is to recognise that Terence is 80 tomorrow.
Hard to believe, isn't it? 1938.
Okay, and can I suggest that we thank Terence so much for coming down to Dorset to talk to us. Thank you.